The mirror that shows who's already behind you. Imagine looking into your bedroom mirror, only to see a stranger standing where you thought it was empty. This isn't a trick of light, it's a chilling, real-world paradox that has terrified families for decades. The story begins in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon, in the autumn of 1998. The Johnson family, Mark, Lisa, and their 10-year-old daughter, Emma, had just moved into a modest, two-story house that was, by all accounts, perfectly ordinary. The house had a creaky wooden floor, a porch swing that groaned in the wind, and a full-length mirror in the master bedroom's closet, an heirloom the previous owners had left behind. At first, the mirror seemed like any other antique piece, a simple reflective surface framed in tarnished mahogany. Lisa, an interior designer with an eye for vintage decor, placed it against the wall, aligning it so it reflected the room's soft amber glow. That night, after the kids were asleep, Mark turned on the bedside lamp and glanced at his reflection. For a split second, he thought he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a dark silhouette standing just behind him. He laughed it off, attributing it to fatigue. But when he turned to face the space directly, there was nothing. The next morning, Lisa walked into the master bedroom, still half asleep, and froze. The mirror showed not her own reflection, but a figure, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured, standing a few feet behind her. Lisa's breath caught. She raised her hand, and the figure's hand, still invisible, mirrored the motion, a thin, ghostly outline of fingers stretching toward her. She screamed, dropped the mirror, and it shattered into 1,000 shards. The family, shaken, called a local psychic, Marla Thompson, known for handling residual hauntings. Marla arrived with a notebook, a handful of sage, and a recorder. She asked the Johnsons to describe the event in detail, pausing each time the room fell silent. "What you're describing," Marla whispered, "is a mirror anomaly often referred to in folklore as a second-room reflection." She explained that across cultures, mirrors have been believed to be portals, not just to an alternate dimension, but to a version of the very space you occupy, where another version of yourself, or someone else, already exists. According to Marla, the most notorious documented case dates back to 1913 in a small village in Scotland. A woman named Agnes MacLeod bought a gilt-frame mirror from a traveling salesman. One night, as she polished it, she saw herself reflected, but the backdrop behind her was a different room altogether, a dim cellar with a single, flickering bulb. When she turned, the room was empty. The next morning, the cellar she'd seen in the mirror had materialized in her home's basement. It was later discovered that a series of unsolved murders had taken place in that very cellar decades earlier, and the mirror had somehow preserved that grim echo. Back in Portland, Marla set up her equipment. She placed a small video camera facing the mirror, turned the lights low, and asked Lisa to sit in front of it. "If there's any movement, even a breath of air, the camera will capture it," Marla said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the recorder. The first few minutes were quiet, just the soft whir of the camera's lens adjusting. Then, as the clock struck 2:13 a.m., the monitor flickered. The reflection showed Lisa, but behind her, a tall, gaunt figure in a tattered coat, its head cocked to the side as if listening. The figure raised a hand, and the surface of the mirror rippled like water. Marla gasped, her recorder clicking furiously. She whispered, "Do you see that? It's trying to communicate." The camera captured a faint, high-pitched tone, a sound like distant wind passing through hollow trees. It was barely audible, but the frequency matched recordings of what some researchers call electropsychic resonance, a phenomenon where unexplained electromagnetic fields accompany paranormal sightings. While the Johnsons were processing the footage, an online forum for the OddWorld community posted a similar account from a user in Manchester, England. The poster, Midnight Watcher, described a mirror in his attic that, every night at exactly 3:07 a.m., displayed a fully furnished living room, complete with a fireplace, a sofa, and a woman sitting on the armchair, knitting. When Midnight Watcher turned around, the attic was empty, yet the smell of burning wood lingered. He posted a grainy video that showed the woman's eyes flickering, as if aware of being watched. The coincidences were too striking to ignore. Both accounts involved mirrors reflecting entire rooms that didn't exist in the physical space, and both featured silent, watchful presences. The common thread? The phenomenon peaked in the early hours of the morning, a time historically associated with thinner veils between worlds. With the evidence mounting, OddWorld's investigative team decided to travel to Portland for a hands-on examination. Lead researcher, Dr. Elena Ruiz, a physicist specializing in anomalous electromagnetic fields, arrived with a portable EMF meter, a spectrometer, and a set of infrared lenses. As the team entered the Johnson home, a sudden chill washed over the hallway. The house seemed ordinary, yet an unseen tension crackled in the air. Dr. Ruiz placed the EMF meter directly in front of the shattered mirror's remains, which had been carefully rebuilt in a protective frame. The needle spiked to 12G, a level rarely seen in any residential setting, especially at night. She adjusted the spectrometer toward the mirror's surface and noted an unusual wavelength pattern, one that didn't correspond to any known natural source. "We're dealing with a localized distortion of the electromagnetic field," she murmured, eyes fixed on the reading. Now, with everything set, Dr. Ruiz turned to the camera crew. "If this mirror truly reflects a room that already exists, behind us, then perhaps we can communicate. I'm going to attempt a simple experiment. I will speak a phrase and wait for any response." She cleared her throat and whispered, "Who are you?" For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, faintly, from the direction of the mirror's broken frame, a low, almost imperceptible echo replied, "You, see, me." The sound was distorted, as if filtered through thick water. The camera's infrared lens caught a silhouette shifting in the background, a vague outline that seemed to coalesce into a shape, tall, faceless, but undeniably present. The team stared, breath held, as the figure slowly lifted its hand, palm outward, as if offering something unseen. Just as Dr. Ruiz leaned forward, the lights flickered, and the entire house seemed to exhale. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the floorboards, and the mirror's surface surged with an unnatural light, blinding the room for a fleeting second. When the glare subsided, the silhouette was gone, but the air was charged with a lingering echo of that whispered phrase, repeating, distorting, as if someone or something was trying desperately to finish a sentence that had been cut short. The thin film of light that had flickered across the glass seemed to settle into something more tangible, as if the shimmer itself was a veil being pulled back by invisible hands. I blinked, willing my eyes to adjust, and the room that had been my sanctuary, its worn armchair, the stack of half-read notebooks, the battered violin propped against the wall, looked exactly the same. Yet, somewhere in the periphery, the familiar hum of the old radiator shifted a fraction, a low throbbing that matched the rhythmic cadence of my own pulse. I turned my head slowly, as if the very act of moving could coax the atmosphere back into a sane configuration. The mirror, now dimmed to a milky gray, reflected nothing beyond its own frame. No phantom silhouettes, no rippling water, only the darkness of the glass, as if it were a blank page awaiting text. I felt an odd compulsion to speak, to fill the void that the whisper had left behind. What are you?" I whispered, my voice catching on the words as they fell into the stillness. The echo that returned was not my own, it was a layered chorus of half-formed syllables, each one overlapping the next, like a crowd murmuring in a language I could almost hear but not quite understand. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and then, without warning, a soft click materialized behind the mirror, a sound like a latch being pulled. The wooden frame shivered, and my heart leapt. I stepped forward, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight, each step a small betrayal of the tension building in my shoulders. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows lengthening as the waning sunlight slipped through the rain-spattered window. My fingertips brushed the cold surface of the glass, and at that instant the world tilted. The mirror's surface turned not opaque but translucent, and through it I could see a child's bedroom, identical in size to my own, down to the cracked lamppost that always bent just enough to lean against the wall, but with subtle differences that prickled the back of my mind. The bed was unmade, a quilt tossed aside as if someone had risen abruptly. A tiny wooden chest sat at the foot, its lid slightly ajar, and a faint golden glow pulsed from within. I stared, transfixed, as a thin, wavering line of light traced the edge of the quilt, moving like a breath across the fabric. The light coalesced into a shape, a faint outline of a figure, no taller than a footstep, crouched near the chest. It raised a hand, its fingers trembling, and began to whisper in a voice that vibrated with static. I could hear the words, though they were garbled, the door must close before. The sentence broke off, swallowed by the same fragmented echo that had haunted me moments before. I tried to listen harder, to catch any fragment that might give a clue, but the sounds were swallowed by a low, resonating hum that seemed to emanate from the wood itself. The mirror pulsed again, brighter this time, and the whisper turned into a hiss that curled around the edges of my perception like a cold wind. A sudden pressure built against my temples, as if my head were being pressed into a vice. My vision blurred, and for a heartbeat I saw my own reflection overlaid upon the child's room, the two images superimposed until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. In the overlay, a doorway appeared, an arched portal framed in tarnished brass, its hinges rusted but still functional. The door stood at the far end of the room, opposite the chest, and beyond it, darkness stretched outward like an ocean of unknown depth. Compelled by a force I could neither name nor resist, I reached out and placed my palm against the glass where the doorway seemed to be drawn. The surface rippled under my touch, diffusing like water disturbed by a stone. The humming intensified, and a pressure wave surged through the room, dislodging dust from the ceiling rafters, which fell in slow, glittering sheets. The light from the chest flared, and the child's silhouette turned toward me, eyes wide and pleading. Don't, it sobbed, but the words came out as a broken chord, a note that couldn't hold its pitch. Another crash echoed from behind the mirror, louder this time, a sound like a heavy book slamming shut. The frame quivered, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping enough that a breath escaped my lips as a misty plume. The child's hands began to rise, claw-like, reaching toward the edge of the glass as if trying to claw through a barrier. In the periphery, the radiator's hum morphed into a low, guttural chant, the same cadence as the whisper that had plagued the room. I felt the floor beneath my boots shift, subtly, as if the very foundation of the house was being recalibrated. My mind raced. Was the mirror a portal, a window, a warning? Or was it something else entirely, a prison for something that wanted out, or a guard preventing something from entering? The cracked, gnarled wood that made up its frame seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, each beat a tap against the wood's grain. Then, as if the house had taken a breath and held it, the whisper snapped back into focus. It was no longer a fragmented phrase but a single sentence, spoken with clarity that sent a chill down my spine. You have opened the way, now the room behind you will claim its own. The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating off the walls, the ceiling, the very floorboards that had just whispered to me in their own creaking dialect. I spun around, half expecting to see the perception of the child's room bleed into my own, to find the front wall dissolved into a void. Instead, the mirror stood as it always had, still, dark, accusatory. The only thing that had changed was the subtle shift in the painting that hung above my desk, its colors now slightly more muted, its eyes, once merely decorative, now glinting with a faint, unsettling luminescence. A low thump resonated from behind the mirror, the sound of a footfall, slow and deliberate, as if something massive had finally decided to step forward. A shadow, larger than any human form, stretched across the glass, its edges wavering like heat over asphalt. The world seemed to hold its breath, the humming reached a pitch that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Then, without warning, the mirror cracked, again, but this time the fissure radiated outward like a web, spider legs of glass spidering across the surface. A bright, searing flash erupted, not from the mirror itself but from the fissure, spilling a blinding, amber light into the room. The light was not just illumination, it felt like an intrusion, a physical force pushing against everything it touched. I shielded my eyes with my forearm, feeling a pressure building inside my chest, as though the very act of breathing were becoming an effort. When the glare finally subsided, I realized that the room behind me, my pantry, the cramped hallway, the cluttered study, had vanished. In its place stretched an endless corridor of stone, vaulted arches disappearing into a darkness that seemed to absorb sound. At the far end, a single door stood ajar, its wood splintered, a pale light leaking from within. My own heartbeat thundered in my ears, reverberating against the stone walls, as the whisper returned one last time, softened now, almost compassionate, "Are you ready?" I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me, the child's desperate gaze flickering between the gap in the mirror and the darkness beyond. The stone corridor stretched forward, and the sound of that heavy footfall grew louder, nearer, each step echoing like a drumbeat. I thought of the phrases that had haunted the mirror, the fragmented sentence that refused to complete itself, the child's pleading whisper, and the rising pressure in the room. I tried to summon any ounce of courage, to decide whether to step forward or retreat back into the safety of the familiar, but before I could move a muscle, a cold, metallic clink rang out, a key turning in a lock I could not see. The door at the far end swung open just enough to let a sliver of pale, phosphorescent mist spill out, and the corridor flooded with a glow that turned the stone to a sickly violet. The shadow that had stretched across the mirror now manifested fully, a shape of indistinct mass, its edges crackling like static, its presence pushing the air as if it were a tide. And then, a voice, not the whisper, not the child's, but a deep, resonant tone, boomed from the darkness beyond the doorway, reverberating through the stone and into my marrow, "The room behind you has been waiting." The sound seemed to ripple through the floor, through the broken mirror, through me, as if the house itself were answering a question I hadn't yet asked. The light from the corridor surged, bathing the broken glass in an eerie violet hue, and for a fraction of a second, I saw, through the shattered pieces, a glimpse of another space, an attic filled with dust-laden trunks and a single, ancient violin that glowed with an inner fire. The child's silhouette stood at the foot of the attic ladder, eyes fixed on me, waiting. A sudden, deafening crack ricocheted from somewhere above, and the stone arches trembled. The massive footfall approached, each step a reminder that whatever had been trapped beyond the mirror was now moving, intent on crossing the threshold. The air thickened, the violet light flickered, and the mirror's broken surface began to pulse rhythmically, as if beating like a heart. I swallowed, my throat dry, and barely managed to whisper, "What do you want?" The question hung in the violet-tinged air, swallowed almost immediately by the echo of the colossal footfall that now stood directly behind the mirror, its presence a void that seemed to absorb even the light. The moment stretched, the world poised on the razor-thin edge between darkness and revelation, and then a sudden, shattering roar erupted from the mirror, and the broken glass exploded outward, scattering shards that hung mid-air like a frozen rain, each fragment reflecting a different version of the room behind me, the corridor, the attic, and something else entirely that I could not yet make out. The shards spun, converging toward a single point, and as they did, a cold hand, gleaming, skeletal, and impossibly elongated, reached out from the center of the vortex, its fingers curled around an invisible rope, pulling, tugging, as though it were trying to drag something, or someone, into the abyss. The pressure built to a crescendo, the sound of the footfall now a thunderous crash, and I realized with dawning horror that the mirror was no longer a barrier but a conduit, and something on the other side was already making its move. The glass rippled like a pawn struck by a stone, each pulse sending a cold shiver up the length of my spine. In the reflection, the hallway on my side remained static, the faint flicker of fluorescent tubes above still casting a sterile white glow. But beyond that, on the other side of the surface, darkness gathered, coalescing into a shape that defied the geometry of any known room. It was as if the mirror had split the space into two temporal slices, the world I knew, and a world that had been waiting for someone to listen to its silence. The figure, a vague outline that hovered just beyond the